It's a very great pleasure meeting you again. I mean, the last time we spoke, we were both in Abuja attending a conference on Nollywood in honor of Professor Okome. So, I mean, it's really very wonderful that you created time to speak with me again today.
No problem.
Yeah. Um, so I was told that there was a conference in Jos on Christian film.
Yeah.
What was the theme of the conference? Did you present there? How did it go?
I didn't. But I'm interested. I'm interested in like the Christian Hausa gospel music that's being done. So, my dad had sent me the flyer, maybe a month earlier, and so I just showed up. It was at National Film Institute.
Okay.
So, yeah, it was very interesting,
Yeah.
and there were a few gospel musicians there that I later was able to interview. Um, but I did respond to, you know how they tap you on the shoulder
Yeah.
like in the middle of the keynote and they're
Yeah.
like, will you be a respondent? So I responded to the keynote, but at the very last minute. So
Hmm.
yeah, Victor Duga's keynote.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
but it was the first one of its kind, so it was quite interesting. In fact, there's someone presenting right now, um, Godwin Ogli, who also does research on Hausa art, Hausa music, especially the Zumun Tumata,
Okay.
the women's choirs in the church.
So it was just
So
music, not film.
no, actually, it was mostly on film.
Hmm.
Interestingly, yeah, I'm interested in kind of the music, especially the music videos in
Mm-hmm.
Joss, because I think I might have mentioned this in our last interview.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in kind of cultural production in Hausa.
Mm-hmm.
And Kannywood, although it's not as well known as Nollywood, so in
Yeah.
some ways Nollywood is more powerful than Kannywood. Kannywood is much more powerful than other smaller film industries or video productions in the north. So I'm really interested in um, kind of Christian Hausa cultural production, because I think often when people hear Hausa, they just assume that it means Muslim, and in fact there are some scholars who have said Hausa is synonymous with Muslim, and that's not really true. There's so many Christians and um, that speak Hausa as well, and that produce um, stuff in Hausa.
Yeah. I
So
mean, I agree with you. I mean,
yeah,
to think that um, the North is synonymous
hmm
with house of production. I mean,
hmm
they are not thinking about the in Nigeria. There's multiple
sure,
cultures. The
sure,
heterogeneity of the
yeah.
culture.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
there's Nupe, the gospel music. There's Hausa, but there's also Verum.
mhm.
There's Tarok, and uh, what was the language that this gospel singer?
Hmm.
Um, I'm forgetting the name of the language but that's one of the reasons I'm also interested in the gospel music in Jos,
Mhm.
because people are producing in languages that are not very big.
Yeah.
And I think there's Nupe film industry, there's the TV film industry, so there are other language film industries. I can only really speak much about Hausa because
Also,
that's what I understand, that's what
yeah.
I speak. But
Yeah.
I'm very interested in kind of the idea of hegemony and what film industries have power and which ones don't. So in terms of what I've written about Kannywood,
Mhm.
often Kannywood is the one that's left out of the discussions.
Yeah.
But then in the north, it is dominant. It's much more it's wealthier and much more well known than some of these other language industries or Christian production in Hausa.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of what drew me to the research. I'm interested in kind of the subaltern speaking.
That's
So
interesting. I wonder if they consider themselves, subaltern anyway. I mean,
which
those
one?
other
The
groups.
I mean, in some ways, I have a problem with Gayatri Spivak's saying that. But subaltern in the sense that people who don't have a lot. I mean, I
Voice.
think what she would say is as soon as they do have access
Yeah.
to speaking, then they're no longer subaltern.
Yeah.
But certainly, I would say they don't have as much cultural power as, let's say, people who have a line to Netflix, right?
Yeah.
So Kannywood does not have that except for Matia Zazao,
Hmm.
which was actually only shown in Nigeria. It wasn't shown on Netflix globally. So Kannywood, there are a few House of Films on Netflix, but they weren't made by kind of the Kannywood film industry. So I would say Kannywood does not have that kind of global access that Nollywood does. But then again, um, you know, the smaller productions in other languages don't have the kind of access that Kannywood
That
has.
kind
So
of
there are all
request.
these levels of power and access.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of wonder when you look at it. So why would Kanye be restricted to to Nigeria on Netflix? Because I mean, the audience is huge, and
Yeah.
there are a lot of very beautiful productions.
I was disappointed by
Yeah,
that, and I don't want to say anything too loud that's going to be distributed. I think when Kenneth Young was talking, I don't know
yeah,
if you spoke with him, but he
yeah,
says Netflix does have um, there's certain quality standards. So
yeah.
if it's not shot in a certain way or something, then they would maybe restrict it to Nigeria. I do think that there are so many excellent Kannywood films I would have loved to see on Netflix.
Oh, me too.
Mati Azazal is not the only one that I think could have
Yeah,
been on
and I'm
Netflix.
thinking about the productions of Sonny Moazu, for instance. I mean,
Mm.
I know
Hmm.
he's a veteran. I mean, he's
Yeah,
has a lot of experiences, and
yeah.
he's performed in many movies. It's a very great writer.
Hmm.
Again, of course, I've never really paid attention to the to the to the quality of whatever he shot lately in terms of
Hmm.
the camera used and
Yeah,
then the standard. But I think again, given the clout of someone like that and
yeah.
a few others who are really good,
Hmm.
and then there are very good stories coming from the north.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, well, there is Arewa 24, which
mhm,
has kind of cornered the market and so some of, I think, the best Kannywood filmmakers are now doing stuff for Arewa 24. Nazir Adam Sali, I often say, is one of the best Hausa writers I know, and he has produced some really popular TV shows
shows.
for also Fauzia Di Suleiman, who's also a showrunner and writer on some of those Arewa 24 shows. So I think they already have someone that's paying them. But if Netflix could pick up on those too, those were very popular. So as far as TV shows, um, yeah,
Yeah,
I'm suddenly blanking on the names of them. But
yeah. And again, so there's so many writers, so many producers, streaming. I mean, screen their programs, their movies on online.
mm-hmm,
The online
mm-hmm,
streaming. So, are there there's something like that in the? I wonder whether we have that
mm-hmm.
in the northern part of Nigeria. Yeah.
Yeah, YouTube. Yeah, there are quite a few people making use of YouTube channels, and I spoke with Ali Nuhu the other day,
Mm,
and he mentioned last year when I visited Kano. So unfortunately, my research is just in little small spurts now. Unlike when I was there during my dissertation research, I was there for 3 years and
mhm,
was kind of fully embedded in the community. Now it's just kind of visits. So unfortunately, I think there are other people who might have better information than I do now. But last year when I visited, people were like, "Oh yeah, when YouTube first came in, it
mhm,
was really good. We made a lot of money, but the rates have gone down." But Ali Nuhu said now with the kind of crisis of currency,
mm,
YouTube is pretty good money because people are paid in dollars.
$10.
So they're while everything else is going down, they're still able to access that. So there Ali Nu has a channel. There are other channels that where people, if they have enough people watching the films, they're able to make money from that. So I think that has kind of been what happened when the VCD died.
Mhm,
Then people moved over to YouTube, and then also satellite streaming. So there's a lot more emphasis on television now. It's kind of back to the old television model
mhm,
that everything started with.
mhm,
Um, and more institutional support because I think Nollywood, the Nollywood kind of broke out into independent productions because television stations were not paying enough.
yeah.
But now with the death of the VCD and the difficulty of being as independent now, then if you can have channels that pay, then that's. Although I don't know that anyone has ever paid enough and what they deserve.
Which is true.
So yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
so I recently I see some skits
Mm-hmm. Mm.
that are collaboration between the North, I mean, I mean, again,
Mm-hmm.
Kannywood actors and Nollywood.
Yeah.
And of course, again, my own idea is, well, I mean, again, nomenclature. We would, probably term Kannywood,
Mm-hmm.
Nollywood. We have the new Nollywood.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have what is called corporate Nollywood now,
Mm-hmm.
which is a kind of
Mm-hmm.
interesting thing. I tend to want to see all of them as one. I mean, they're
Mm-hmm.
different parts of the
Yeah.
same coin,
Mm-hmm.
which is. But then again, one thing that kind of interests me a lot is the fact that now we have, you know, collaboration
Mm-hmm.
between, of course, I'm talking at the individual level anyway.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, at the, if you like, at the level of production, big
Mm-hmm.
productions that exist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, I mentioned this guy would come. I mean, even Nuhu Ali. I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
there's some
Oh, I mean, from the
production.
beginning. In fact,
Yes,
he told me like his first films were actually in Lagos.
you see,
Yeah.
yeah.
So he was at UniJoss,
Hmm.
and so I think he became involved with the Hausa film industry there. But he was also in Lagos and doing stuff there before he went to Kano.
If I went to Kano,
So
yeah.
he has always been in both Nollywood and Kannywood
Yeah, because
films.
what I feel is that some of these things are just artificial boundaries.
I
Yeah,
think so. I mean, there's the whole debate over
yeah,
Kannywood, and
yeah,
then some people saying, "Oh, Kannywood is just separating themselves out,"
yeah,
etc. Although, of course, that name
yeah,
Kannywood existed before the name Nollywood.
yeah,
Um, but I think the question of whether everyone weighs in on, and I've written about this too. What is Kannywood? What is Nollywood? And so I think it depends on who you talk to. Some people would say, well, yeah, Kannywood is a subset of Nollywood if we're thinking about Nollywood as the Nigerian film industry as a whole. But generally, when people are talking among themselves
yeah,
about it, both the practitioners and I think the audiences,
yeah,
they would think of Kannywood as
yeah,
those films made in Kano or Kaduna, Jos.
yeah.
They all get subsumed under Kannywood. But even with all the differences in what's done in Nollywood, it's the same thing as Ali Nuhu reminded me a few
Yeah.
weeks ago with Bollywood. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's films in Telugu and other film industries that
Mm-hmm.
they don't like getting subsumed under Bollywood. But when you hear Bollywood, you think India, whereas it actually, if you break it down, it's like the Hindi film industry.
Hmm.
But when people outside hear it, they think of all of
I
India.
think
So
it's
I think the same thing
the
probably
same thing.
happens with Nollywood. Everything gets lumped into Nollywood, even though there are all these different parts of the industry.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think again, I mean, for me, I feel that this whole idea, speaks to the beauty of the whole thing, and
mm,
because there's certain characteristics associated with different, regions.
hmm
When you talk about the Yoruba, I mean, and then the East and then the North.
hmm
So, do you think that, again, I'm asking at least from the scholar,
hmm
lottery point of view, do you think that there's certain themes associated with the North, with Kannywood, or
mm,
which embrace the Jaws, Benue,
yeah.
uh, and so on.
Um, you know, Back when I was doing my dissertation
Yeah.
research, the way people talked about Kannywood, they said there's the chamama and there's a sentimental.
Mm-hmm.
So the chamama is like the fast, like made in 1 or 2 days. The comedies with Ibro
Mm-hmm.
and then Alta and Baba Ari and some of those comedians that
Mm-hmm.
play kind of typecast roles,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just very fast and easy to make. Whereas the sentimental are the more melodramas, some often adapted from novels and so on that talk about family and love and so on. Now I think that has kind of, because there's no more BCD,
Mm-hmm.
it's that's changed a lot, and a lot of times the comedians appear in the bigger budget films and so on. So that's the way it used to be talked about. Um, I do I mean, there are a lot of family dramas in Kannywood. The same
Mm-hmm.
thing with Nollywood,
Not
I
with
would
Nollywood,
say,
yeah.
right? A lot of sitting around in living rooms and talking
Yeah.
in both industries.
Yeah.
Um, Kannywood does tend to have a lot of love stories,
Mm-hmm.
and there's not as much singing and dancing now because of the television, the going to television. But when there was a lot of singing and dancing, that was very distinctive of Kannywood. Although I think that in some of the old Yoruba films, there were also singing and dancing. You can tell me if you know about that, but I think I've read that there was singing and dancing in some of those films made in the 70s and 80s in Yoruba films as well. But definitely, if you see singing and dancing in a film, that's usually, at Kannywood, a marker of Kannywood. Um, but that that there are a lot of love stories, but there's also thrillers and political
Mm-hmm.
sagas and social critique and so on. So I think a lot of times when critics were writing about it, they were always focusing on the love stories and being very critical of the singing and dancing and so on. But they're Kanyewood covers a lot of themes.
That I mean, that's what I thought too. I mean, I mean, I see, even though which is kind of interesting to me, which I think is a feature of stereotype,
Mm-hmm.
that people talk a lot more about the love stories
Mm,
as opposed to, because for me, I think there's a kind of subtle films that a
yeah.
critique of.
Well, I mean, that's the
Yeah,
same thing with the literature, right? It's
yeah,
called Literaturfansoe, love stories. But
yeah,
there's if you actually read them, there's all
yeah,
kinds of things going on. Even Balaraba Ramat Yakubu's "Sin is a Puppy That Follows You Home." It's the only Hausa novel of that era,
era.
from the 1980s on, that has been translated. Um,
Hmm.
and it was translated. The translation was paid for. It was published by Indian publisher Blaft, which focuses on publishing pulp fiction from India. And they heard about Litte Fansoye and they were very interested. And so a lot of the publicity around it has been like, oh, this is like a Bollywood soap opera. But if you actually read the
Hmm.
novel, it's not. I mean, it's a very Hausa story.
Yeah,
And it's not very much love in it. It's
yeah.
so like a broken home, a terrible father
Hmm.
who abandons his wife. The daughter has like a little tiny love story, but if you look at that as representative of Letizia Fansoya, it's not that. It's not. So I think it's often a lot of times there was a lot of debate around them, especially in the 1990s, and the critics who didn't like it would say, "Oh, these are just romance novels. This is trashy stuff," without actually spending the time to read it. And I think the people that actually read it and the scholars who write about that have much more nuanced takes on what it is. So someone like Yusuf Adamu, one of the early scholars, also one of the early novelists, calls it contemporary Hausa literature, which is Adab and Hausa, um, uh, Adab and Hausa Nazami or something. So I think that's a much more sensible way of classifying it.
Well, transparent.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, when people look just at the surface level, that's a
Mm-hmm.
big problem. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Pierre Mathieu talked about, when you want to critique your work, or what you look at, you need to look at the gaps and the silences.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a very subtle way in which a lot of things, are brought out.
Well,
And
I mean, I think a lot of the early criticism of Nollywood was
yeah,
like that, right?
yeah,
But now there's much. I mean, if you go online, there's so many blogs and so much, so many reviews of them, that you can't just say Nollywood is one thing anymore.
yeah,
The It's gained enough social power,
power.
right? Or what does Bourdieu call it? Uh, um, my theory has left my
Yeah,
head, but
yeah.
it has that social power. So you can't just say it's one thing anymore, because
Are
there are
you talking
plenty
about
of
agency?
no.
No.
This is
Okay.
so embarrassing that I've forgotten this
No,
word. I
that's
use it
okay.
all the time. Um, it has, anyway. Let me not spend a lot of time on that, but it has enough people see it, and enough people with social power see it, that you can't just say Nollywood is one thing. And I think Kannywood doesn't have quite as many people writing about it, but there are quite a few younger scholars coming up. That I think there's a scholar named Musin Ibrahim, also Nura Abubakar. They have blogs on Kannywood. So I think as more people do that, then it's just really hard to just stereotype it as one thing.
That's interesting. So, I mean, you raise a very important question. Social and the power of
Mm-hmm.
the, of film. So, what would be your comment on that in Kannywood? I mean, are there? I mean, do you think what are the major preoccupations?
Mm.
And then again, do you think the movie, I mean, in Kannywood, they have any noticeable influence?
Um, First, let me tell the story that
Yeah,
was so exciting about Lagos,
yeah,
and then I'll move. So when I was flying in on KLM the
yeah,
other day into Lagos,
yeah,
the pilot, or maybe it was the flight attendant,
yeah,
said, "Welcome to Lagos, home of one of the largest film and TV industries in the world."
yeah,
And I never heard that flying into Nigeria, and I was
yeah,
so excited by it because I was like, "That's the power of media and the film industries, right?
yeah,
Like it's not like home of the worst traffic in the world or home, you know,
yeah,
home of the slums or whatever, which
yeah,
is often how the foreign media has represented
yeah,
Lagos or Nigeria. It's like home of one of the largest film and TV industries. So it was just I was so proud
yeah,
when I heard that. So I
yeah,
think for those who have criticized Nollywood for airing dirty laundry or showing Nigeria in a bad light, I think a lot of those critics are not talking as much anymore because Nigeria now, as if you're talking about rebranding Nigeria, which I think Dora Akine was talking about, during Obasanjo
yeah,
time, there was all the time about rebranding Nigeria. And so without much government assistance, Nollywood has been able to do that. So as far as Kannywood and social power, again, I think because society is a bit more conservative in the North, they haven't always gotten the kind of support and financial support that Nollywood has, and so I think that's still an issue in Kannywood. They're getting more, like with Arewa 24. Part of the reason why everyone went over to them was that they were bringing in money. But I do think that it's a very huge market, and if there were financiers who were interested in getting involved in Kannywood, there's so much good storytelling. Um, they're really talented people working in Kannywood. So it needs a little bit more financial support. But it is very influential. I mean, especially now with social media,
yeah,
and young people now are not limited to being able to watch things on TVs, on VCDs, but they're following on movie stars on Instagram and TikTok and everything else. So I think the filmmakers themselves have a lot more power because they're able to market themselves through those social media platforms.